There are few things in this world as complicated as love. Some say it's a fleeting experience, one that is seemingly there just to make us survive as a species. Others say it's an important driver in our lives, to give more of ourselves to another, even through our darkest moments. Yet if one were to look at media's depiction of love, you would think that it's the most important aspect of our own lives. But what happens when one is raised to believe that idea, but is unsure of their own self? One who hasn't found happiness within themselves to keep going, not only in their goals, but in life. And what would happen if this person was given reins to a miracle? Which is what Ruby Sparks sets to find out. Ruby Sparks is a 2012 romantic comedy directed by Little Miss Sunshine duo Jonathan Dayton and Valerie Ferris. It discusses the idea of a romance through the viewpoint of one who is not satisfied with themselves to a highly negative degree and the hardships that are necessary for a relationship to evolve. Written by Zoe Kazan, who plays the film's titular character alongside her longtime partner Paul Dano, Ruby Sparks is anything but romantic. If anything, it is more about deconstructing the manic pixie dream girl trope that indie films typically fall back on, as well as the idea of learning to be happy with oneself before attempting to find love in someone else. Enter Calvin Warefield, a once hugely successful LA writer who has struggled to write a large-scale novel ever since his late teens. Calvin is not a happy person, and what I mean by that is that he does not have any love for himself. He's insecure, he blames his issues on external sources, he constantly makes excuses, and is overall socially withdrawn. Alongside the fact that Calvin's life is just filled with negativity. His writing is stagnated, he has an ex-girlfriend who left him right after his father's death, he has no friends, and he has an inability to accept praise.
You are a genius.
Don't use that word.
All the hints of someone who feels unfulfilled in their current situation. All of that changes, however, with a recurring dream of a beautiful girl by the name of Ruby Sparks, a burst of inspiration that leads Calvin to write his largest project in years. He spends day in and day out writing about Ruby, filling in as many details as possible, to the point of becoming a slight obsession in order to stay close to his fictional character. However, odd things begin to occur over the course of his writing sessions. Women's clothing and items begin to appear in his apartment until one day, a miracle happens.
Oh, damn it, Scotty. Nothing. My dog has to pee. It's fine. I'll put him in the backyard.
I'll take him out.
Great. Thank you.
Initially skeptical of the whole situation and worried for his own state of mind, Calvin is then convinced that Ruby is real and is quickly swept off his feet. Ruby is spontaneous, loving, creative, sociable, and an overall joy to be around. She gets Calvin to experience the world outside of his apartment, which leads Calvin to be as elated as he'd ever been, fully convinced that Ruby is his way to a happier life. However, anyone who's experienced a breakup can tell you that is a dangerous mindset, and this is where the film begins to start its slow decline from quirky to disturbing. It starts with the inevitable loss of spark in the relationship after dating for several months. The honeymoon period of spontaneous lovemaking and excitement has begun to wash away, which all begins when Calvin's mother attempts to get the two to visit her and her lover Mort for a weekend getaway. Visibly annoyed, Ruby pesters him to go to no avail, as Calvin's stubborn nature begins to take over. Which is when the audience begins to notice that Ruby is always the one to make plans to have fun. Even in his dreams, Ruby has consistently been the one to suggest exciting activities, while Calvin just goes along for the ride. It's only when Calvin agrees to visit his family does the spark return, but it's quickly faded once they arrive, mainly due to the fact that Calvin did not agree to go for Ruby's happiness, but rather to avoid the possibility of her discovering the manuscript from where she came from. His decision did not come from an act of selflessness or to enjoy themselves outside of the apartment, but his own selfish desires. It's once they arrive at Mort's home does the distance between them become further apparent. Ruby takes an immediate liking to Calvin's mom and the hippie-like nature that her and Mort have embraced, having fun with her at family games, enjoying the California sunshine, while Calvin spends the entire weekend indoors, attempting to keep Ruby to himself.
Why don't we stay somewhere else tonight? Just you and me.
Oh, it's so fun! You're missing out!
I promised Langdon I'd finish his book. Why don't you come up here with me?
Woo!
Which brings up one of the film's biggest themes. Unfulfilled lives lead to unhealthy relationships. One's partner should not be there to make your life have meaning, but rather to enrich the one you already have. Calvin envisioned Ruby as this free-spirited, lovable person without taking into account how he himself does not enjoy that aspect of life. His stubborn, clingy nature convinces him to try and make others do what he wants instead of allowing himself to become part of the fun of others. Calvin isn't allowing Ruby to be herself, and it's this constricting nature that finally breaks Ruby down to her lowest point. As Zoe Kazan put it herself, there are simple ideas about people, there is no simple person. In fact, the majority of their problems can be noticed within Calvin's final dream about her before she became real, displaying the differences between reality and his idealized version of love. Calvin writes an exchange between him and Ruby that showcases his personality flaws, but written in a way to find them endearing. His stubborn attitude is played off as a cute trait when in reality it's a driving factor in their increasingly failing love life, and when Ruby says she normally dates more assertive men, Calvin's natural response is to relate assertiveness to douchiness, which would normally be seen as insecure but again is written to seem endearing, all pointing to the fact that Calvin, having only one serious relationship in his life, does not understand how people work.
Women are different up close. I love Susie, but she's a weirdo. She's a person. You haven't written a person.
The relationship reaches its breaking point at a party thrown by Calvin's publisher. As the two split off, they're each confronted with issues relating to their love life. Calvin bumps into his ex-girlfriend while Ruby is slowly seduced by Calvin's publisher, giving her a taste of the assertive excitement she typically enjoys being with. This is when the audience finds out who Calvin truly is. His problems with Ruby aren't solely because he wrote a fictional girl, but because that's who he is at his core. He begrudgingly introduced his novelist ex-girlfriend to his publisher out of jealousy and fear. He stagnated the relationship by attempting to make it all about him instead of them, and when confronted with said reality, he pushes it aside by focusing on the poorly timed breakup. He takes no responsibility for his actions instead of attempting to see her side of the argument, meaning he's never learned his lesson. Leading to the final fight of the film where Calvin's darker side begins to truly appear. It's clearly evident that Calvin's lack of control over Ruby is his biggest dilemma.
You're supposed to be my girlfriend.
I am your
So
girlfriend.
act like it.
Jesus, you're gonna be such a fucking prude.
Why, because I don't want you skinny dipping with other men.
Because you don't want me doing anything.
And it's at this moment where the slow, disturbing decline reaches its darkest point, as Calvin willingly shows Ruby the manuscript. To prove where Ruby came from, Calvin forces her to do an assortment of tasks against her will, from speaking French to snapping uncontrollably. The tasks eventually become humiliating until Calvin forces her to repeat the one phrase he's been avoiding the entire film, allowing himself to bask in the glow of his own arrogance by having his supposed loved one praise him to a godlike status, a trait he's been keeping hidden for as long as humanly possible. Frightened beyond belief, Ruby locks herself in their room, and Calvin, horrified by his actions, writes her freedom from the manuscript. She's found gone the next morning, and after some comforting words from his brother, Calvin finds the inspiration to take the relationship and making it into his latest novel, ditching the old-fashioned typewriter for a modern-day laptop, signifying Calvin's progression from his old self to a better one. Eventually running into Ruby once again, with no memory of her past life, with the film hinting that the two will once again start over. Yet while the film paints this as a somewhat inspirational tale, I choose to see it as a cautionary one. There is no true indication that Calvin has learned from said experience, rather choosing to use it as the basis for his novel, detailing what it is like to fall both in and out of love, meaning that when he sees Ruby once again, it all comes down to whether he can cast aside his insecurities for the sake of the relationship, or it'll all come crashing down once again. Ruby Sparks is an interesting look into how an idealized version of love can warp our minds, by focusing on the idea that love does not make one feel accomplished, but rather is an added bonus to an already existing life. That being in love with someone means understanding that person's individuality and working hard to find a common ground. Yet it's also a hopeful look into modern day dating, that as long as one can learn from the mistakes of the past, to look beyond their own insecurities, then love will find them when they least expect it. And maybe, just maybe, things will be different.